Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business. From Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years leading debates on responsible business issues inside the European Parliament, I host our discussions of the very latest developments on corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, the taskforce on inequality and social-related financial disclosures, or TISFD, whose draft is currently open for public consultation. This is an attempt to harness capital markets to drive equality and people-based issues through corporate disclosure, seeking to repeat the success of the TCFD on climate, now a decade ago, and the TNFD on nature, which we've previously covered on this podcast. We'll ask whether inequality really is a risk to business and whether there really is the same appetite for reporting on social issues from companies. Our guest to discuss this is the TISFD Executive Director, Simon Rawson. Simon, a big welcome to Frankly Speaking.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Now, as I often ask my guests first before we get onto the subject, where did you first get into sustainability in your life or in your career? Where does it come from?
That's a good question. Well, I started my career as a diplomat for the British government, and in my overseas postings, sort of did a bit of development work, international development work in Pakistan. I think that was my first sort of professional encounter with sort of social sustainability and social development. When I came back to the UK, I started work for a management consultancy and spent a number of years working on corporate sustainability in-house within a large global management consultancy. And then maybe I got the sustainability bug, but I wanted to go a bit further. And so I left the private sector and joined a campaigning organisation, an NGO called Share Action, which is based in the UK and campaigns for responsible investment. And then after learning a huge amount there, just last year took this opportunity to come and support the work of TISFD. And in some ways, I like to feel like that's bringing together all the different bits of my career, because there's definitely corporate sustainability, there's definitely sustainable finance, and there's an element of diplomacy in it too, bringing it together in a multi-stakeholder task force.
We don't be too diplomatic in this conversation, and I'll be doing my best to ensure that you're not. Now, and you're joining people who've got the bug. A lot of our listeners have got the bug, and so it's great to have you here today. Now, obviously, in a podcast, we're not going to present the consultation version of the framework, but just for our listeners who may not have read it, just pick out some examples or key characteristics from the version you've published.
Sure. Maybe just very briefly to sort of situate the context for this work in case anybody hasn't seen it. You mentioned the relation to, or the parallels with the work of TCFD and TNFD, the task forces that worked on climate and nature related financial disclosures respectively. Our work at TISFD sits in the context of high and persistent levels of inequality and a recognition, an increasing recognition that those inequalities are driving systemic risks. Those are systemic risks that you can't diversify away from and which are not always visible, or often not visible, in decision making, both within companies and within the investment system. And the purpose of the task force is to bring those risks and opportunities in addressing them into scope, to make them visible, so that the businesses, so that their investors, so that other stakeholders understand the impacts and dependencies that businesses have on people and the risks and opportunities that arise from those. So that's the context in which our work sits. But the approach is very similar to that's been very successful with TCFD and TNFD. It's a set of conceptual foundations, so clearly describing the relationships between business and finance, people and inequality, the pathways through which those impacts and dependencies become risks and opportunities, providing evidence of how those become material, and in providing recommendations around what information is useful and how to provide that information in a way that's consistent and comparable. So what you'll see in the first version of the framework that we've just published, and I want to emphasize it's very much a first, and we call it a beta draft because we know it's a work in progress. It's not finished. It's not perfect. The purpose of publishing it is to seek feedback so that we can continue to iterate. But those are the components you'll see in that first draft. So some conceptual foundations and some draft disclosure recommendations. And coming up in the future, you'll find guidance to aid implementation, and you'll find recommendations on metrics and targets.
One of the consistent and running comments that I hear is, oh yes, we can do it on climate, we can do it on environment, because the risks and opportunities are more measurable, the metrics are more robust, they're more mature. But we can't do it on social issues because there's a lack of maturity, a lack of robustness. I've never bought that argument, and I've said that many times on this podcast. But if you're talking about human rights, if you're talking about social issues, answer that doubt. That it's too fuzzy, that when our understanding isn't clear enough, that it's too difficult to put financial measures on those topics.
You've almost, exactly set out the reason that we exist, which is to myth bust that and to show that you can be clear about how impacts and dependencies on people. And by the way, to be clear, when we talk about people at TISFD, we're talking about workers, both in their own operations and also in value chains. We're also talking about communities in which businesses operate, and we're talking about consumers and end users. So it's a very broad definition, and you'll recognize those categories. Anybody that knows anything about ESRS, the European Standards for Sustainability Reporting, will recognize those four stakeholder categories, and we've deliberately built our framework around those two. But as I'm saying, that is what we set out to do, is to clarify those pathways through which those impacts become material, and to provide recommendations on how we can build convergence in how we measure those risks and opportunities. So I think it's slightly misleading to say that there's a lack of maturity. I would say there's a lack of clarity, and there's a lack of consistency from geography to geography, for example, in how we focus on and measure social issues. But in some ways, people have always been at the heart of business, and business absolutely depends upon them. And so we exist as a task force to try to bring that clarity, and in a collaborative and co-creative way. So we're looking for help to do that and build consensus across the market.
I do want to come back and ask you about the relationship with ESRS and the global standards of ISSB a little later. But there have been really good attempts, which I'm sure you'd acknowledged, and I definitely would, in relation to measuring, or metrics for measuring the social impact of companies. I'm particularly thinking of Social Value International, which has operated for many years. I myself, in a small way, helped the development of the social indicators of the World Benchmarking Alliance. Clearly, GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, has got good social indicators within it. How is what you're doing different from what they've done, and how much have you drawn on those existing frameworks?
We draw massively on the work that already exists, and we have a sort of golden rule, which is if something exists, we're not going to reinvent it. We're not going to create something new. We're here to drive convergence and harmonization, not proliferation and fragmentation. So WBA, World Benchmarking Alliance, was one of the founding partners of TISFD and sits on our steering committee. GRI is a knowledge partner of TISFD, and SVI through the impact management platform, we also interact with. And for all those reasons, we're drawing on that knowledge that exists, those frameworks that exist, and trying to drive harmonization globally. Maybe one of the sort of legitimate challenges to the social disclosure space thus far has been that there have been too many frameworks. There hasn't been consistency and convergence, and we hope we can do that. We're having this conversation in the context of corporate sustainability disclosure being being challenged by business and now by policymakers, because it has advanced to such a level that it has perceived to become a prohibitive burden. And so our role is not to add layers onto that burden, but to try to provide simplification, convergence, harmonization, to enable businesses and their stakeholders, including investors, to get to that decision useful information, and not to add on layers of reporting for the sake of reporting.
Perceived to be a burden by some, not everyone. I can just hear some of our listeners crying out. But putting financial figures on child labour, I remember years ago now having that discussion. Is a certain amount of child labour acceptable and within the boundaries of what should be enabled? But and you have those discussions. I've even had that discussion about torture. Is a little bit of torture okay? And these are absurd sentiments when you actually think about them, and you're trying to put those into financial terms, and there will be people who think this is just not going to be possible. Tell them and tell me why that's wrong.
Well, that's not exactly the framework that we're building. One of the reasons there's been a challenge in building convergence on social issues is that you have multiple different paradigms operating in parallel, and one is the paradigm of fundamental rights, inalienable fundamental rights. Alongside that, you have paradigms of human and social capital, and increasingly a paradigm of well-being, a sort of multi-dimensional concept of the different aspects of people's lives that you can measure, which sort of describe how they're faring in their lives. One of the conceptual foundations that we set out is that we believe that those three paradigms and others need to operate in parallel, and you can't substitute one for the other. So what am I saying? I'm saying that you start with fundamental rights. Businesses have responsibilities under the UN guiding principles, and that's the starting point.
But the question is, can you put a financial value? The aim of what you're trying to do is to understand financial risks and opportunities. Can you put a financial value to what are these fundamental rights?
Our fundamental starting point in the framework is that of human rights, and you know better than I do, better than anybody does, the responsibilities that are enshrined within the UN guiding principles for businesses to respect human rights. We also go on to say that there are financial risks and opportunities which businesses should be quantifying and making decisions around. And violations of rights can often lead to financial risks. But we certainly don't say that there's an acceptable amount of human right violation. That's fundamentally not what our framework says. And so I think the task force would disagree with the premise that there's a tolerable amount of human right violation that is not a financial risk.
And I'm not accusing you of that in any way, just to be very, very clear. What I suppose I'm getting at is the whole debate about single versus double materiality. There's a lot in your draft about impact. You're very interested in impact in this draft and in your work, and so that looks like it's a double materiality approach. But some of the critics of TCFD and TNFD say that it's not really about impact. It's not really about double materiality. It is about the impact on the financial prospects of the company. And that's a little bit blurred, I think, when I read the TISFD draft. Which side, if either, do you come down on, and why?
We start from the position that understanding social risks starts with understanding impacts and dependencies. And so questions of what you might end up disclosing are oftentimes dependent upon the jurisdiction within which you operate. So as a task force, we haven't sort of pronounced that we think you should disclose on the basis of double materiality, or we think you should disclose on the basis of financial materiality. It's a question we're considering and reflecting upon. But what you saw with other task forces is that ultimately it's how those recommendations are taken up in the standards that are set by different regulators and in different international or regional disclosure requirements that determine a materiality lens or approach. But you're right to say that we have a strong focus on impact because, as I say, our view is that when considering social issues, the first thing you need to do is to start with understanding impact and dependencies. And by the way, the first thing you need to do in understanding impact is human rights due diligence. And so we hope that we can show that in the social space, all of those things can and need to sit together. What you might end up disclosing, as I say, oftentimes depends upon, you can make a judgment as a preparer of what you want, the materiality approach you want to adopt, but oftentimes that's determined by, the regulatory regime in which you operate. So you won't find us in that draft saying, we're here advocating for a double materiality approach. We're here advocating for a financial materiality approach. Rather, we're trying to explain how we think impacts and dependencies are the basis of understanding risks and opportunities related to people, and how the foundational principle for all of this is fundamental rights.
I said I wanted to talk about the European and global standard setting process, the ESRS you've referred to, European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and the work of the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB. And this is a devil's advocate question, but you appear to be rowing against the tide. Our ISSB has clearly said climate first. It's not rejected other issues and says they're implicit and explicit actually in their general requirements. But their first standard is a climate standard, and they're not moving anytime soon to a social and human rights standard. They are researching it. And then the ESRS, the European standards, were going to be across those four categories of people that you described earlier, but they've rowed back onto own workforce as the first priority, and they're allowing other aspects of people impact of business to be delayed and part of phase-ins at later points, as well as simplified. And so you're trying to wave the flag and be the champion of social related issues that companies impact at just a time when the regulators, it can be said, or the standard setters are moving away and showing they're shy of moving in that direction. Does that worry you? And how can you be successful in that context?
I mean, my first reaction to that is, again, it just reinforces the need for the task force's work and the need for the leadership of the members of the task force. So this is a task force that is business-led, it's finance-led. It's also, by the way, labour-led and civil society-led. We're a multi-stakeholder task force with leaders from all sorts of organisations across the world in the global north and global south in this task force leading this work. And they're showing that there is market demand and market leadership for bringing people into the scope of corporate sustainability and associated disclosures. So you're right, the context is one that sustainability finds itself challenged. Regulators find themselves rowing back. And so that's why I feel even more conviction about the work that we're doing. But I think that the fact we have ISSB aspiring to be a global baseline, the fact that we have European sustainability reporting standards, which set a high bar globally for sustainability reporting, is a brilliant place to be, because these give us the frameworks in which to plug in. We're not creating parallel, standalone, separate, fragmented recommendations. We want to inform future standards.
But do they want to listen? Do they want to listen?
We have knowledge partnerships with all of the standard setters and are actively exchanging information, whether it's to inform ISSB's research project on human capital, whether it's to provide guidance to help companies to provide really good ESRS disclosures. We're talking with all of those standard setters. Whether the political will is there to set further higher standards right now, I would say not. I mean, if it was, we wouldn't need to do our work. But in the same way that it was TCFD and TNFD as market-led initiatives which helped to make the case for those disclosure standards, that's what we're here doing. So, is it going to happen, next month? No. Are we working to make it happen over coming years? We certainly are. And beyond Europe and the US, there are markets out there that are very interested in what we're doing and looking at adopting things in shorter time, or at least drawing on our recommendations and our research to inform work they're doing. There are countries in Southeast Asia, for example, that are developing social taxonomies. Remember that? They're developing social taxonomies and they're drawing on our research to help inform that. There are countries in South America that have got social elements of their taxonomies and they're drawing on our research to inform that. So I would agree with you completely. I think I'm completely agreeing with you about political will around sustainability reporting right now. But I'm arguing that through market leadership, through showing that there's momentum, we can help advance those over years to come.
And by the way, I completely support you on that. It seems to me TCFD did a brilliant job to win the case for climate. Because of the technical aspects of its work, and I know that you're trying to do the same for inequality and people-related issues, and I hope you succeed.
It's both the technical work, where I think, as you said, social is complicated. We're here to try and provide clarity and build understanding, but it's also showing market momentum. And I think one of the most powerful things that TNFD did was that they have now some 700 plus companies making TNFD aligned disclosures. And I think that's very powerful when you speak to regulators and you say the market is doing this, come along with us. And we're working to do that at TISFD too. So although we're still in the early stages, we're building a large group of businesses that are starting to pilot test our framework. Even though it's just in the first beta version of it, they're starting to test it with us, rigorously test it, challenge us to make sure it's a market usable framework as well. And we hope that in time they'll become the early adopters of the framework. And I hope that in 3 years' time, I'll be back here saying that we've got 700 businesses preparing disclosures in line with TISFD recommendations. And I think that makes a much more compelling case to ISSB, to ESRS, and to other jurisdictions around the world about the standards that they could be setting.
Are you allowed to share any names of companies or numbers of companies?
We have a handful on our website who are publicly disclosed as being members of our alliance. So we have Coca-Cola in our alliance. We have Airbus in our alliance. Those are a couple that come to my mind first up. Across the stakeholder groups, we've got about 400 in our alliance at the moment. That doesn't mean they're all preparing disclosures. I'm not saying that. The pilot group's much smaller than that. But I am quite encouraged by the uptick in interest we've seen in our work in general this year, since the start of the year, and then in particular since we released our first beta draft. We struggling to keep up with demand from the number of organizations who are keen to join the alliance at the moment.
It's approaching the end of the public consultation. It's not too late, though, for listeners if you want to contribute to the thinking, and I encourage you to do so. Clearly, you're going to look carefully and thoroughly at the responses that you've had, but just at an informal level, what sort of responses are you having?
That's right. We are copying the playbook of TNFD and having an open and iterative development process of the framework over the next year and a half. So there's a chance to feed in now through the platform we've built on the web at tisfd.org. You can go there, you can read through the framework, and you can make very informal, light touch comments almost on a page by page basis. So this is not the sort of final formal public consultation. We'll certainly have one of those when we have a final draft. But this is very much more in the spirit of come and help us beta test this first version. Tell us what you think. Tell us what you like, what you don't like. Brilliant if you have a chance to do that before the end of July. If you don't, that doesn't matter. There'll be opportunities again over the next year and a half to do so, and I'd encourage you to do so. And then, as I mentioned, we'll certainly have a sort of formal public consultation towards the end. What are we hearing so far? Well, the messages we've heard so far across the work that we've done, in fact, have been really like that you're bringing rigor to understanding this. Can you try to make this as accessible and least technical possible to enable me to have conversations in the boardroom, to enable me to have conversations with my investment teams, to enable me to have conversations with my finance teams? Like all domains of sustainability, there's a real risk that we go into jargon, that we go into technicality. We've been really challenged to try to keep things as simple and as accessible as possible. More recently, since we published the first beta framework, and maybe this is also as a result of the fact that CSRD is now bedding in its sort of updated form, we've particularly been challenged, in fact, as to how, to your question earlier, how does TISFD relate to ESRS? Because, even with the adjustments that have been made to ESRS more recently, it's still a world-leading standard for sustainability reporting. And we've been able to clarify in our own minds and in how we're interacting with companies on it, that increasingly some of the value that TISFD can bring to those that are preparing CSRD disclosures or thinking about it is through the tools and the guidance and the resources that we have to enable really good ESRS disclosures. So those may be the first things. I mean, other themes that we get constantly are, and reasonably are, about how a global framework can cover social issues which can be so local and geographically specific. And part of that is just about the fact that the nature of our framework is that it is global. But we think it contains everything you need to be able to apply it locally. It's not a prescriptive tick box framework. That's not the type of framework this is. But it's the concepts, it's the typologies, it's the evidence that you might need to apply this in different local contexts. So that's another piece of feedback that constantly comes up in conversations.
When I read the 12 categories for the state, defining the state of people, I really like them. I like that housing and access to housing and the business role in relation to that was in there. You don't find that a lot elsewhere. And I love the last one, which is people want meaning and purpose in life. And they do. We do. I do. You do. And how we can measure that. Now, these are ambitious things to say. We'll see where they come down, but I congratulate you for asking those questions and having those within your thinking. A couple of final questions I want to put to you. There will be many businesses listening to this discussion who are not already part of your pilot, but might say, yeah, we want to be part of this. We want to be early movers. We want to show the opportunity to do this. What would your advice to them to be about how to do that?
Well, first I'd say brilliant. I mentioned that we're market-led and want to build a market-usable framework, there are very many ways to get involved in our work at all sort of levels of commitment, if you like. We have this group I mentioned just a moment ago, the TISFD Alliance, and it's a growing community of organizations that are interested in our work, want to learn more, and maybe want to get involved in shaping it. It's very open and easy to join the Alliance. Just visit our website, tisfd.org, and sign up, and we'll invite you to webinars, and we'll invite you to focus groups and so on. And there are other ways to get more involved. If you want to continue on that journey and become a pilot tester, we can certainly build you into a pilot group going forward. And ultimately, our task force is, the product of many, many dozens of brilliant individuals all over the world working together to build this framework, whether they're from civil society, whether academia, whether they're from the labor movement, whether they're in business or in finance, working together in technical working groups, in steering committees, in regional councils, dozens, if not hundreds of people making this framework happen. And so there's a role for you if you'd like it. But there are lots of ways to get involved. It doesn't need to be too scary. You can find some hopefully accessible materials, some videos, and some materials on our own website. We'd love to welcome you to the Alliance. And if you'd like to go further, there are plenty of ways to do that too.
Final question. You mentioned that earlier in your career you were a diplomat and you were in Pakistan. And I suppose, to me, that is the test. If you look at a country like Pakistan that has got a huge informal economy outside any legal protections, where there are some great companies and great people and organisations, but where there's also a very high incidence of poverty. For those people that you know intimately because you were there, is it possible that what TISFD is doing will actually make a difference?
Well, I don't claim that I can do that, but I look to our steering committee, and we're really lucky to have a brilliant leader of an Indian trade union called SIWA, which is the Independent Women's Workers Association in India, with millions of members. Rima Nanavati is the lady who leads that trade union and who's on our steering committee, and she holds us to account exactly on that question of informal workers and how is this framework going to help create decent employment, which brings rights and helps to create better outcomes for those individuals. So it's through that multi-stakeholder, diverse perspectives in the task force that I feel confident that we'll be able to do that. And interestingly, Rima, when I first met her, when I first took on this role and spoke to her and said, I said exactly that. I said, what can this framework do for you and your members? What are you looking to us for? And the first thing she said, it's about climate. It's about climate change, because increasingly people can't work. The number of lost days to extreme heat in India for independent women workers is becoming unmanageable. It's destroying incomes and it's pushing people into poverty and vulnerability. And if you can build a framework which helps businesses to understand how their impacts are driving those who are least or most vulnerable and least able to withstand the effects of climate change further into vulnerability and poverty and at risk, then that will have been successful for me. So we try to the maximum extent possible we're building this framework in a way that connects across people, nature and climate. It is not a standalone social framework. It needs to be integrated into how businesses are thinking about climate change, thinking about their transitions, thinking about workers in all of their forms, not just directly retained employees. It's a huge challenge, but with the collaborative efforts of, as I say, dozens, if not hundreds of people, we'll give it a good shot.
Well, good luck with that challenge. I think it's a noble one. I think it's a necessary one. And we look forward to inviting TISFD back onto the podcast next year when you get towards your final draft. Sadly, we have come to the end of our podcast today. Thank you very much to Simon Rawson for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Richard.
You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us now on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again to Simon and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.